Sorry, I'm multitasking here. Okay, so that is something that you can use. It actually works really well with live conversations as well, and as well as live presentations, since we're all going back to in-person events. If you're training live events, this will actually work for that as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and launch a poll really quickly because accessibility is much more than what we think it is. So I will launch a poll and tell me, when you were designing learning materials and presentations, which of the following do you consider? And there's no right or wrong answer, but what do you currently consider when you're designing your learning materials, your presentations, your training programs, things like that? Okay, good. We have a good mix here. Yeah, give it a couple more seconds for people to answer, and then I'll end the poll. All right, looks like everybody's answered. And this is encouraging to me. We have a really good mix of people who consider different things when they are designing their training programs. And really, accessibility has to do with all of this. Okay, it has to do with all of this. And if you haven't considered some of these things before, I'd like to start off with a little bit of an exercise here. I want you to go ahead and take a minute and read the following conditions that are on your screen. So go ahead and read through them, scan through them, and I want you to pick one that resonates with you. And when you've picked one, I'd like you to go ahead and give me a thumbs up emoji or a thumbs up on your screen. Okay, just give it a couple more minutes. Seconds, really. So when you've picked one, give me a thumbs up emoji.
Okay, I think the majority of people have.
Great, okay. So now I want you to do a little bit of a visualization. I want you to think about your day so far. So right now it's about lunchtime, okay? And I want you to think about if that situation that you picked, if that actually applied to you, what would be different about this day if this condition or situation applied to you? And think about it from the time that you got up and everything you've done so far today up until the time you sat down for this session. And what barriers would you face, if any? And if there are any tools that could help you get here to this time right now, sitting at your desk. So think about that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put you into breakout rooms so that you can discuss this. Okay, so again, what would be different about this day if this situation applied to you? What barriers would you encounter, if any, and what tools could you use to help you get here? So I will go ahead and put you into breakout rooms of about 3 people because we've got a small group today. Okay. And I will go ahead and send you off and you can have a discussion. Sound good? I'll give you about 5 minutes. Okay, welcome back. Welcome back. So we're not going to go around the room and ask everybody, but I'd just like to ask maybe one or two people to share what you discussed in your breakout room. What would be different about this day? What barriers would you face, or what tools could you use?
I can start. I
Go
think
ahead.
it was very eye-opening when Eric was talking about people with a high spectrum of autism and the way that you communicate. And he was talking about how certain nuances in the way that we communicate, like it wouldn't work for them. You have to be very black and white, very direct. And then the way that you would, if you were a facilitator and you had somebody, you'd have to change a lot of what you do. So I think it was just eye-opening all around what we considered and how things change based off of who we chose or what we chose.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Jerome. One more person.
I can go. So there were three of us, and it's interesting that all three of us picked ADHD, but completely different symptoms of it. So even though it's that one thing, but we have completely different symptoms of it. So we actually face different barriers. And for certain things, we're not sure which tools we could use to kind of face it. One person has a hard time remembering things. Another person has hard time focusing, especially at home, distractions. One person has hard time sitting still, So I think we're just kind of learning which barriers and which tools we could use for pretty much the same condition, but different symptoms of it.
Yeah, thank you, Slavi. So that actually brings up a good point, that they say in the disability community is, and usually they say with people with autism, I mean, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. If you've met one person with ADHD, you've met one person with ADHD, because symptoms are so varying and they're so widespread. Okay. Did anybody choose something that wasn't a disability necessarily? Did anybody choose the one with low literacy or what was it, the language barrier? Okay. So things to consider when you're thinking about trying to bring access to people. And so let's talk about what accessibility actually is and what it means, okay? So accessibility is obviously the ability to access, and it's either a functionality or a system, and basically it means entry of how you gain related benefits. And it's the degree to which a product, service, or environment is accessible by as many people as possible. Now you'll notice that I just read from the screen, and what do they tell us in training school? Never read from the screen. Why? Why do we tell people never read from the screen when we give them presentation skills training? You can unmute yourself or just type it in the chat, but why do we tell people never to read from the screen?
They can read for themselves.
They can read it for themselves. So I'm going to push back on that a little bit, because remember, one of the conditions that I put up there was the person who had a third grade reading level and was hiding it, or the person who had a vision problem and couldn't read the screen. So I'm going to push back on that just a tiny bit and say that you can read from the screen. Obviously, you don't want to read from it word for word, but you also want to keep in mind that some people may not be able to read what you say. They may not be able to see the screen at all. So describing images and reading the text that's on the screen is not necessarily a bad thing. Obviously you don't want to have too, design principles and things like that. You don't want to have too text heavy or anything like that, but it is one of those things to consider, that not necessarily everybody can see or read the screen for themselves. And when we talk about accessibility, it really means that if something is accessible, it's easy to reach, it's easy to enter, it's easy to speak with, or it's easy to use. And accessibility doesn't necessarily mean just people with disabilities It could mean people who have low literacy, people who have English language barriers. It could mean also people who have internet issues. Right now, we're in a digital world right now. So how many of our workers or how many of our employees have digital barriers where they're unable or they're unfamiliar with the tools that we're using? So that digital literacy is also could be an accessibility issue. So if something's really inaccessible, there are barriers to that information and knowledge, and access is cut off. Now, what accessibility is not is an afterthought, and I'll go over that in a little bit, but it's not really an afterthought. It's something that we should be thinking about consistently throughout all of what we are thinking about when we design. It's also not a nice feature. It's not a nice to have. It really is a must have. Something that we should really be incorporating. So it's not really optional. And especially if you are a federal contractor and you're designing e-learning, there is something called Section 508, which requires us to make all of our e-learning accessible for people with disabilities. And accessibility is not just for a few people. So a lot of people think, well, accessibility is just for those people with disabilities. I don't have anybody on my team who doesn't have a disability, blah, 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 blah. 1 in 4 people in this country and throughout the world has some kind of disability. So chances are that somebody in your audience, somebody in your training class, somebody in your presentation audience will have some kind of disability that gives them a little bit of a barrier into what you were trying to convey to them. So really, accessibility is for all people. And the last thing that I want to say is that accessibility does not have to be scary. I think when we think about accessibility, we start thinking about all the rules and the regulations and, oh my gosh, compliance and how things are just overwhelming. And so what I'm going to talk about today are just some low-hanging fruit that you can kind of implement some tools right away to kind of reach as many people as possible with what you can do now, and leaving the accessibility compliance experts, to their job. Because I'm not necessarily an accessibility tech expert. I'm just an accessibility in what I know how to do. That's where my tools and my knowledge lie. So accessibility does not have to be scary, okay? So when we think about accessibility in design, I want you to think about a cake, okay? And what it takes to go through making this cake. So what are some of the ingredients that you put in a cake? Just go ahead and shout them out. What are some things that you put in a cake?
Eggs.
Flour,
Eggs, flour,
Sugar.
sugar,
butter,
okay? Other ingredients that may make the cake whatever flavor it is, right?
Vanilla extract.
Vanilla extract, that is really important, okay?
Frosting.
Frosting, okay?
Applesauce.
Sauce, all right?
No, the applesauce for sweetener.
There you go,
Slightly different,
applesauce
but
for
yes.
sweetness, that's sugar, right? Okay, so think about all of these ingredients. And one of the things that is a key ingredient in any type of cake is the egg, right? So usually flour and egg. So what happens if you make a cake and you decide you're gonna make the cake and then you're just gonna add in the accessibility or the egg after the fact, okay? So making accessibility an afterthought is like adding eggs into a cake after you've already baked it. It doesn't do any good. It also makes the process harder. So this analogy came from somebody by the name of Cam Wadwan. I hope I'm saying his name correctly, but he's an accessibility expert that you can follow on LinkedIn. He gives a lot of great accessibility tips and a lot of things to consider when you're designing user experiences. But he likens it to putting eggs into a cake after you've already baked it. It's kind of gross, right? So it's the same thing with accessibility. When you think about it as an afterthought, it actually creates more work for you than if you were to think about it from the very beginning. And when I think about it from the very beginning, one of the things that you can kind of think about when you're talking about planning these things and trying to incorporate accessibility is you want to think about something called universal design. And universal design also means inclusive design. So here's an example. Universal design are those things that are broad spectrum. So they're buildings, they're products, they're services. They're actually inherently accessible to a wide variety of people, older people, people without disabilities, people with disabilities. It basically utilizes the principles of design thinking to create accessible solutions. So think about something that everybody uses that was designed specifically for people with wheelchairs. Can you think about what that would be? What is something that almost everybody uses on a daily basis that was originally designed for some people with wheelchairs, who use wheelchairs? Think of something outside. Yeah, ramps, okay? You got it right there. Ramps or curb cuts. Who uses them other than people with wheelchairs? Who uses them?
Everyone.
Bicycles?
Everyone, everyone. Anybody who's got anything with wheels, moms with strollers, dads with strollers, delivery drivers, skateboarders, skate rollers, you know, whatever it is, we all use it. We all use it, but it wasn't designed for us. It was designed for people with wheelchair usage. So that's the principle of universal design, is that even though we design for people on the quote unquote margins, everybody else in the middle benefits. So when you design with accessibility in mind at the very beginning, and you think about, okay, how do I incorporate people who may have English as a second language? How do I incorporate people who may have a vision problem or a hearing problem? How do I do all of that? And how do I design for those people? Everybody in the middle benefits. You know, you may have noticed that on social media lately, a lot of videos have automatic open captions. That's the difference between open captions and closed captions, is that open captions is automatic. It doesn't give you a choice. It automatically pops up for you. And you notice a lot of people who are on the bus, or who maybe in a place where they can't really put earphones in, they may use the closed captioning. Me, I like to use transcripts for podcasts because I find it easier to actually read the transcript than it does for me to actually absorb the information as I'm listening to it. Really depends upon what I'm doing at the time. How many of us listen to audiobooks on the way to work, right? Those things were actually designed for people who were blind or had low vision. So things that actually are designed for people on the quote unquote margins benefits all of us in the middle. So I'm gonna basically play a short video here, and it talks about the accessibility principles. And it's really short. There's no narration, but it hopefully the music will come through.
Gwen, don't know if you saw the note. There's no audio coming through. It looks like it's not enabled.
Okay, it's just music. Thank
Oh,
you.
no problem.
Using Powtoon.
Okay, so we'll talk about Powtoon in a minute. But basically, those are the 4 principles of accessibility. It must be perceivable, it must be obtainable, it must be robust, and it must be, sorry. Okay, sorry, and if you didn't hear the audio, it's just music. But those are the 4 principles of accessibility called POUR. But really, I think about that, but what I really think about is I have a little bit of a checklist, and these slides will be made available to you after the fact. I'll make sure that we send them out. But there are some universal standards that I try to adhere to when I make PowerPoint presentations and when I make documents. And really the biggest ones are high contrast colors. I think a lot of us know about the contrast colors, that you need to be able to read the words that are on the certain background. One of the things that I like to say is also you want to think about using text or symbols instead of color to distinguish different items. So for example, instead of using green or red a green or a red circle to distinguish yes or no, or good or bad. You could use a check mark or an X, because there are 1 in 12 people in this country are colorblind. So you want to think about that. I usually, have, yeah, Eric, again, it's the shade differential. So you want to look at that. There's some tools that I'll give you too to kind of check that. I usually try to make my PowerPoints fonts pretty large, at least 24 if I can. Try to provide closed captioning and provide transcripts. You can use automatic subtitles. You can use Microsoft Translator. And believe it or not, 50% of the people in this country read at a 6th grade level or below. So if you think about our general population, especially if you're working with people who normally don't have access to a computer, chances are that they may have a reading level that's 5th grade or below. So I try to make my presentations around that reading level. Recording everything, having handouts, using an accessibility checker. Those are some things that I do for my PowerPoint presentations. For my documents that I actually hand out for handouts, there's a whole bunch of other things. These are mostly checklists for people who use screen readers. So those screen readers are the ones that actually, for people with low vision or blind, they actually have a screen reader that narrates from left to right, top to bottom. And these tips, which I will send out in a slide, are basically things that you can use to help make things accessible for a screen reader. Okay. One thing that I will say for accessible documents as well is that you always want to use sans serif fonts. I think when we design documents, we try to get all fancy and we love to use our little fonts, but sans serif font are the ones without the squiggly lines above or below the line. So using something like Arial or Verdana actually helps people with maybe dyslexia or dyscalculia. It helps them actually read a little bit better. So those are some of the things that are here, and I'm not going to go through all of them. I will make sure that this all is sent out to you after the session today. So there are some things that you can do as far as checklists are concerned. And I do want to also point out that when you are designing things, especially when you want to have accessibility in mind, you want to think about inclusion, which basically means there's a saying in the disability community that says nothing about us without us, which means please don't make decisions for us without including us in the conversation. So if you know people who are in your audience who have disclosed that they have these challenges or they need these accommodations, include them in the design process and ask them, what is it that you need in order for me to make this accessible for you? And if you include them in it, again, at the beginning, as opposed to at the very end, then you don't have to backtrack and make changes to things that you've already worked on. You can incorporate that at the very beginning. Okay. So before I go into the additional resources and tools, what are some things that have struck you so far as to what we've talked about so far? So somebody said that they had to remap everything. Oh, data visualization company had to remap everything. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm just looking at the chat.
What I meant by that was that we were doing an incredible amount of work of depth in data for expense management and procurement, supply chain analytics, things of the sort. So a lot of that kind of information would normally be translated for reporting purposes into all kinds of graphs and visuals. And those graphs and visuals often come with pre-templated sets of colors or things that people thought looked good. And to those with shade deficiencies or color blindness, they can't distinguish even with a legend. So we had to rethink the way, quite literally, that we would go through design. And that carried over into everything that we delivered to clients. And it became part of the narrative of how we thought about data visualization. So all the things that we thought we knew were the standard rules for neurotypical or normal people didn't apply for those with different types of challenges or alternate ways of perceiving.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Thank you for bringing that up, Eric. You know, it really does challenge the way you think traditionally that we design for pretty much everybody. And so when you design for those challenges in mind, it actually helps benefit pretty much everybody, because a lot of people will use those tools or will use those accommodations, even if they quote unquote don't have the need for it. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. Okay. So here are some, I promised some tools. So here are some tools that you can use, and I'll show you how some of them work. So Microsoft, so you don't have to think about, Microsoft is really great about accessibility. They have an entire accessibility department and a chief accessibility officer. And the reason for that is because the CEO has a son with cerebral palsy. So he really does think about things with accessibility in mind. So when you're designing new PowerPoint presentations, they have a ton of accessibility templates already there. So these are accessible friendly templates. You just have to, when you design a new template, you just go and look for accessible or accessibility, and it will pop up all of these templates for you. It also does it in Word, and it does it in Excel as well. So you just have to take that template and adapt it to your needs. And all Microsoft programs actually have something called an accessibility checker. And I will actually show you how this works in the current PowerPoint that I'm in right now. Okay, so you will notice that up here where it says review, there is something that says check accessibility. And so when I say check accessibility, it pops up everything. And I purposely left it so that there's a lot of errors on here. But everything on the right under accessibility will tell me what's missing. So I'm missing alternative text for these pictures on these slides. I'm missing a slide title, because that's important for screen readers on these slides. I may be missing caption for an audio. It will also tell me if I have color contrast issues. It will also tell me to check something called reading order. So you know how you have different blocks that are of text that may be in a different reading order. Does it pop up for a screen reader in the right order that you want it to appear? So that's a really great tool for you to use. It is available on Word, PowerPoint, and Excel, I believe. So all programs have an accessibility checker, which I would encourage you to use. And I would do that before you convert it into a PDF, because it will automatically translate that into a PDF accessible for you. But if you have a PDF document, there is also an accessibility checker in a PDF as well that you can use before you do that. And that's really important, especially again, if you are a federal contractor and you receive funds from the federal government, you are required to make sure that your PDFs that you put online or distribute out there are accessible. So here's an interesting thing that I like to use. So I use this during my live presentations, not necessarily over Zoom, but in person. You can put closed captioning or subtitles in another language on PowerPoint that will appear at the bottom of your PowerPoint screen as you are speaking real time. So for example, I'm giving a conference presentation in June. I will be putting this on there so that subtitles automatically appear at the bottom of my PowerPoint presentation. You know, because we have Zoom and all these other things for virtual, but for live presentations that are in person, we don't necessarily have them. So it will actually do that. It will also put it in different languages for you. You can only do one at a time, but it will use it for you. So that's under slideshow. Always use subtitles, and it will actually let you choose the language that you want as well. You can also use Microsoft Translator within PowerPoint as well. So you'll see here that I translated it from Filipino to Filipino, but you can again choose whatever language you want. And here are the tools out there. Yeah, technology is awesome. Here are the tools out there that have automatic closed captioning already on them. They're not perfect, but they're pretty good. So Zoom already has automatic closed captioning. You just have to enable it. Microsoft Teams automatically has it enabled. You can have closed captioning on YouTube, Vimeo, and there's something called otter.ai, which does translation transcripts and closed captioning for you, and it's a nominal fee, but they do have a free service as well. So all of these are actually, they have a free version, but they're not perfect, but they work pretty well. Okay. And for those of you who are local who say, oh my gosh, I need actually a little bit more than that. I need like an ASL interpreter, or I need somebody to do live captioning. So that's something called cart services, where somebody actually plugs into your Zoom account and they actually will do the closed captioning for you real time. They can also, it's a little bit more accurate than automatic closed captioning. These are the two services that I know of here in Hawaii, IL Interpret and Hawaii Interpreting Services. And the great thing about using local services is that they know local lingo and they know local vernacular. So I could go with a company on the continent, but they're not going to know what POW means, and they're not going to know what they're not going to know what some of Wana'o means. They're not going to know what any of that means. So using a local service for that is a great choice. And I've used IL Interpret several times, and they're pretty good. They're a little costly, I will admit, but you're paying for a human being to be there with you and translate. But if you need that, they are a really good service. And here is a little add-on that I love. It's called Bright Slide from Bright Carbon. Okay, Bright Carbon is a PowerPoint presentation add-in plug-in software company, and they actually give you some cool slide effects that will help you with your PowerPoint presentations. One of the things that they do have, if you use text in a text box, they have something that's called an automatic color contrast checker. So you can see here that if I right click on these words here, it will tell me what my contrast ratio is. And you should be at 4.5 to 1 at least. And I've given you the address here. And again, these slides will be available to you. Okay. And you'll notice that the video that I played earlier was made with something called Powtoon. Powtoon is actually, they do have a free version, but you can also sign up for free if you want to use the paid version. They do a lot of really great videos, but their videos are accessible. They do put closed captioning on there. They enable you to do voiceovers. So for example, if you've got somebody who is blind or has vision impairment, you can describe what's in the video as a voiceover, and you can also do narration. So there are certain things with accessibility that you can do with Powtoon that you can't do with some of the other services that are out there. So I've put they've given us a free trial sign up, I believe, and you can use that link at the bottom to sign up and check it out. It's pretty cool. You can do a couple of different things with it. So we are at 15 minutes, and I always like to have a little bit of a discussion. So before we do go into this discussion, I kind of want to ask, what are your thoughts or questions so far? You know, Slavi, I'm wondering if Canva does it too. I think they do have some accessibility things built in. I think we just have to look for them or ask them.
Yep, I just wrote down definitely something that I'm gonna look into.
Yeah.
Gwen, this is all really, really great. Thank you. Super packed.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay, so I know we have about 13 minutes left, and I always like to end it with a little bit of a discussion. So I'll leave you with a choice. So here's another thing about accessibility. I always go choices. We can either go back into our small group discussions, or we can stay as a large group and we can discuss this. I'll leave it up to you. Let's discuss what's one thing that you think you're going to do differently when you design learning materials and presentation, or what's your biggest takeaway? So would you like to go back into your groups, or would you like to stay as a large group, because we are a smaller group today, and discuss?
I'd love to hear in the large group.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. So I'll open up the floor.
Okay, I'll go ahead and be the first domino. One thing that I want to do differently is, now that I have awareness of all these different tools that you introduced to us, Gwen, I want to use the eggs before I bake. instead of doing it afterwards, and knowing that these options are there in tools that I already have is going to be helpful to ensure that I'm creating something that is for everyone.
Okay, thank you, Jerome.
I agree with Jerome, checking out the excellent resources that you provided to us today, and definitely incorporating those and sharing them with my team. So when we do trainings to the company, that we're definitely being mindful of everyone.
Thank you, Brittany.
For me, I'm just wondering now, with all our ATD material that we send out, is it accessible? Because it comes to us from ATD National. These are the colors you got to use. These are the fonts you got to use. So I'm just kind of wondering now, because I actually don't know. I mean, I hope they thought of that, but I do want to do some research and see, are all these really things accessible when it comes, especially I'm focusing on digital, since that's usually how we communicate. But yeah, just curious about that now.
And one of the things too, since we're talking about the digital stuff, is if you do like, advertise your training on social media or like an internal social media type of platform. Sometimes some platforms will have alt text available. So for example, LinkedIn, which is a Microsoft company, will allow you to have alt text in for some of your images. But I always still put image descriptions in my social media because sometimes screen readers don't capture all text. So you'll notice that when I do social media posts, especially on LinkedIn, I'll have my little thing, and then at the very bottom, I'll just say image description. This is what's in the image. And you don't have to describe every single little itty bitty thing. So for example, this image right here is of a woman in a wheelchair. What's the actual intent of the picture, why you used it? So for example, the reason why I chose this one is because it happens to be a woman in a wheelchair who's in a business setting. She's in an interview. So that would be what I would convey, woman in a wheelchair in an interview setting. Okay, it doesn't have to be detailed. You don't have to say what race she is or anything like that, unless it has something to do with the actual intent of why you pick that picture. So I would encourage everybody when they're doing their social media posts or when they're putting that out there to, when you do alt text, is to really think about the intent of what the picture is, what's the message that you're trying to convey with that picture. So thank you for bringing that up, Slavi. Anybody else?
I think just remembering to,
go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say the closed and the open captioning, and remembering to have those things enabled or make sure that people understand that it's available. That could work well with language translation issues as well, not just to another language, which you showed us, also those where either English is a second or third language and we're dealing with much more diverse audiences who might find it easier to be able to follow along, or those who can't hear really well in a busier environment. It's easy to follow more. It would be easier to follow.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. And one of the things that I do when I play a video, whether it's in person or virtual, is I automatically put the closed captioning on, just for that reason specifically, because I do train a lot of classes where I don't know my audience. I don't know who's coming in. I don't know what their challenges may be. I don't know if they need that type of accommodation. So I automatically put closed captioning on when I play a video in my training classes, just because I'm not sure who may need it for that very reason. So thank you for that. Christy, you were going to say something.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say that I'm gonna do everything differently now. I'm especially interested in using that accessibility tool and the translation, because we have a lot of interpreters at Kali Palama Health Center. So I want to see like how good of a translation it does, because a lot of the ones that we've been using, it's not super great, the translation. So
yeah, it's not perfect, and you have to, it does tell you when you're speaking too fast, because I'm on it right now. And it does tell you when you're speaking too fast, because it does kind of show up a little bit garbled. But it does force the people who use the tool to slow down a little bit so that and enunciate so that it's a little bit more translatable. But yeah, I've used it with Filipino and it actually is pretty accurate. It's pretty amazing. I'm really surprised with the amount of languages that it supports. So, hey, okay. What questions do you have for me? Here's my contact information. Again, I will send out the slide deck afterwards, but what questions do you have for me before we close and before I hand it back to Jerome and Cassie?
I do have a question, Gwen. This is Eric. Let me see if I can stream this out of my head. So when you're, let's say, for example, you're giving a presentation to an audience that you're not familiar with, it's a new environment, how do you go about asking the client or the audience to be for more information about these things, or what to consider ahead of time, or issues that you should be particularly aware of, or sensitivities that you should have, or how do you gracefully do that either with an audience in real time or in planning ahead?
So what I usually do if I'm in that situation, and most conference planners should do this, but what I do is I say, if you need any type of accommodation, this is especially important if they need something like ASL or CART, like, you know, the live translation services. If you need any type of accommodation, please let me know by X date. So that I can secure these services for you. Most people who need special accommodations are used to asking for them, but by giving them a date to ask for them, then they know that they have that amount of time to ask for it. Now, everybody else is probably not going to disclose that they have some kind of accommodation need. And I know this just from personal experience.
Right.
So people maybe with dyslexia will not tell you because, you know, they don't really think to disclose it. Or people who have mobility issues may not. So I try to use something called universal design for learning, or universal design principles, to kind of think, okay, how can I reach as broad of an audience as possible? So using that checklist that I gave you really helps me there. Trying to think about giving choices as to how people absorb information is also one of the things that I try to do. So you really can't ask, you know, like outright, I just ask if somebody needs an accommodation. I also try to think about, you know, the two main things that people, especially digitally, the two main things that people have challenges with sometimes are either hearing or vision. So those are the two things that people normally associate with accessibility. So obviously having the closed captioning available. And one of the things that I do, which I didn't do today, which I normally do when I'm giving this type of presentation, is I will give a visual description of everything that's on the screen, including myself. So what I will say is, for those of you who can't see me, because some people are on their phone and some people are driving and some people are, you know, obviously won't be able to see me. For those people who can't see me, I will say I'm a Filipino woman with black hair and glasses, and I'm coming to you from my, you know, office in Kapolei, Hawaii, or something along those lines. Super, super, super brief, so that they know, you know, a little bit what I look like. And people, it feels awkward at first because you're like, people know what I look like, they're looking at me, but some people can't. So those are just some things that I've learned to consider along the way. And it's just I pick up more and more things as I learn more and more. And one thing to also keep in mind about accessibility is that you're not going to be able to reach everybody. So just reach for who you can. And the interesting thing is, like what Slavitsa was talking about earlier with the ADHD and the different symptoms, it's also the same for people with disabilities. So I'll give you an example. My son is autistic, and he does not consider himself to have a disability because he just thinks differently. But when he rides the bus, you know, here and everywhere, the bus is required to have the flashing lights for people who are hearing impaired, and they're required to have the big loud noises, right, that say beep, 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 we're going to Kalihi. And for him, that is sensory overload. So when he rides the bus, he has to have earphones in, he has to have a hoodie on, so basically that's where his disability comes out. So something that is beneficial for one group actually can be contradictory for another group. And we can't please everybody, but we can try to reach as many people as possible.
Yeah.
So I hope that answers your question. We have about 2 minutes left. What other questions do you have for me?
Do you see anything coming up with new changes in either policy or practices, either between different countries or just ways of thinking about this that are changing, well, literally doing that, changing policy? Are you hearing or keeping track of any of that?
Yeah, a little bit. The White House just came out with an executive order for all federal contractors to increase their accessibility efforts, and federal agencies. They've done it already for a while, but they're increasing their efforts to make it even more widespread. Other countries, unfortunately, it depends on the country, are not as accessible. The reason why we have accessibility standards is because we have laws. So other countries may not have the same laws. There are international accessibility standards, like for the web design and for things like that. But for presentations and training and development and learning, there's not really a universal standard unless you're talking about a methodology called universal design for learning, which I could do a whole nother hour on. But I'm more than happy to send you that information. But I follow it a little bit. It's not really in the news all that much, so I have to really dig for it. But it really depends on what laws are in the country that you are in. Okay. Well, it is 1 o'clock, so I will go ahead and turn things back over to Jerome and Cassie. Thank you, everybody, for your time and attention. I really appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jerome, we can't hear you.
Wow, I was talking for like a whole minute. Thank you, everybody. And if we can give another mahalo to Gwen for presenting such informative and information. I think we can all take away something from this talk. We do have one small announcement. I know we're running over. Slavi, if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah. So for those that don't know me, I'm a VP of marketing here at ATD Hawaii. So I send all those wonderful announcements to you. I want to thank Gwen. I do want to tell you, pencil your calendars because we're working on something May 31st. So it's going to be exciting. And I also wanted to say, if you can follow us on LinkedIn, woohoo, you find us there under ATD Hawaii. That's where all our info is. And when it comes to Facebook, we actually kind of had to move from our page, long story. So we have a new page. And if you search for ATD Hawaii 808, you will find us at a new page. So the old page, we cannot close it down by the wonders of technology, but we don't post on that page. So if you can follow us there, that would be great. So ATD Hawaii 808. And I know Gwen is not, she's in a different role right now, but I want to say we are looking for VP of events. So if anybody knows anybody, if you're interested, let us know. So right now we're all kind of pitching and helping with it. But yeah, it would really help us out. And that's it. Thank you all for joining us today.
All right, mahalo, everybody. Thank you for joining us at ATD Hawaii, ATD Tech SIG. We look forward to continuing to have these discussions, to bring in speakers like Gwen, and to continue to build this community. But until we see you again, light and aloha to you all.
Mahalo, everybody.
Hey.
Mahalo, Gwen.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Gwen.
Good job, Gwen, even though I was like super late.
I gotta go, everybody. See you.
Bye.
Thank you.
The one thing I was gonna say is, did you show the color thing? Like how they can test the colors?
The bright carbon, actually, I showed it for PowerPoint, but not necessarily for WCAG, which because I'm not really all that crazy about the ones that are on for the web because they're a little bit kind of complicated for me to use. If you have one that you use all regularly, go ahead and send it to me and I'll plug it into the PowerPoint before I send it out.
Okay, yeah. I'll send those over to you because I normally use them a lot when we do designs with our tech company, and I make them run through the colors, the fonts, also to make sure that it's compliant for adaptability.
Oh, great. Yeah, if you could send it to me because I'm compiling a resource list of accessibility stuff. So yeah, the ones that I use are kind of cumbersome. So if you have something that's a little bit easier to use, I will plunk that in there.
Okay, great job. Thanks, Gwen, for doing this.
Thank you for inviting me. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye.